Welcome to the Cartoon Codex. Tonight, we're diving deep into the disturbing underbelly of Family Guy, exploring the darkest theories, most controversial episodes, and genuinely unsettling aspects of a show that started as harmless satire, but evolved into something far more twisted. What you're about to hear isn't just about cartoon violence or edgy jokes. We're talking about theories suggesting mental institutions, dead families, systematic abuse, and a reality that might not be real at all. So settle in, because this is going to get dark. The Dark Foundation. How Family Guy Became Disturbing Family Guy premiered in 1999 as Seth MacFarlane's answer to The Simpsons. A show about a dysfunctional Rhode Island family getting into wacky situations. Peter Griffin was a lovable idiot. Lois was the patient wife. Meg was an awkward teenager. And Chris was the dim-witted son. Stewie was the evil genius baby. And Brian was the intellectual talking dog. On the surface, it seemed like typical animated sitcom fare with some edgier humor thrown in. But something happened over the show's run. After getting cancelled in 2002 and then brought back due to massive DVD sales and Adult Swim reruns, Family Guy returned in 2005 as a different beast entirely. The characters became meaner, more Flanderized versions of themselves. The cutaway gags got darker and more disturbing. The treatment of certain characters, particularly Meg, crossed lines that made viewers genuinely uncomfortable rather than making them laugh. The show that once had heart beneath its crude humor transformed into something that felt almost sadistic at times. Peter went from being a well-meaning buffoon to a psychopathic man-child who seemed incapable of empathy. Brian evolved from a voice of reason into a pretentious, self-absorbed hypocrite. Stewie's murderous tendencies became less comedic and more genuinely disturbing. And Meg, poor Meg, became the punching bag for abuse that went from being a running gag to systematic emotional torture. This transformation didn't happen overnight, but fans noticed. The show started producing episodes that weren't just controversial because of offensive jokes, but because they dealt with genuinely dark subject matter in ways that felt less like satire and more like cruelty. Episodes about abortion, transgender issues, terrorism, and domestic violence pushed boundaries in ways that made even longtime fans question whether the show had gone too far. But here's where things get really interesting. As the show got darker and weirder, fans started developing theories to explain why. These weren't just fun speculation about cartoon logic. These were deep psychological analyses suggesting that the entire show might be taking place inside a mental institution, or that we're seeing everything through the distorted perception of a psychotic baby, or that the family we're watching died years ago, and what we see is a grief-stricken father's delusion. The disturbing theories about Family Guy aren't just about shocking revelations. They're attempts to make sense of a show that seems to have lost its internal logic, where characters do increasingly horrible things without consequences, where reality seems to bend and break on a whim, and where the suffering of certain characters is treated as entertainment rather than tragedy. What makes these theories particularly compelling is that they actually explain a lot. Why can Peter survive being shot, blown up, and mutilated in one episode only to be fine in the next? Why does Meg endure abuse that would destroy a real person without ever getting help or escaping? Why does Stewie seem to exist in a different reality than everyone else? Why do the chicken fights cause millions in property damage without any legal or financial consequences? The answer, according to these theories, is that none of this is real. not in the way we think. And once you start looking at Family Guy through that lens, the entire show becomes much more disturbing than it appears on the surface. At Brian's death, when Family Guy manipulated mortality. Let's talk about one of the most shocking moments in Family Guy's history. The episode that proved the show was willing to do absolutely anything for ratings and attention. In November 2013, Season 12, Episode 6, titled Life of Brian, the writers did something that seemed impossible. They killed Brian Griffin, not as a joke, not as a dream sequence, but apparently for real. The episode starts innocently enough with Brian and Stewie playing street hockey, but Stewie goes inside to get his knee pads, and in those few seconds, everything changes. A car comes speeding around the corner and runs over Brian, hitting him hard enough to cause fatal internal injuries. The driver doesn't stop. Brian lies bleeding in the street while Stewie screams for help, and what follows is genuinely heartbreaking in a way Family Guy had never been before. At the veterinarian's office, the family gathers around Brian's bed. He's conscious but fading, and he knows he's dying. The scene is played completely straight, with no jokes, no cutaways, no comic relief. Brian tells each family member he loves them, gives a final speech about how lucky he was to be part of their lives, and then dies on screen while the family watches helplessly. The funeral scene continues this surprisingly sincere tone. The family buries Brian in the backyard with a headstone reading, "Brian Griffin, loyal friend, faithful companion." There are tears, eulogies, and genuine grief. Stewie blames himself because he destroyed his time machine earlier in the episode, claiming he was tired of the constant disasters it caused. Now he has no way to go back and save Brian. But here's where it gets manipulative. The episode ends with the family adopting a new dog named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico from The Sopranos. This wasn't presented as a temporary replacement or a red herring. The showrunners went out of their way to make Brian's death seem permanent. Seth MacFarlane himself posted a farewell message to Brian on Twitter, thanking fans for loving the character. Merchandise featuring Vinny started appearing. The next episode, Into Harmony's Way, aired without Brian, featuring Vinny as the new family dog. Fans were devastated and furious. Within hours of the episode airing, a petition demanding Brian's return gained over 100,000 signatures. People got tattoos memorializing Brian. The outrage was so intense that it made national news, and their parents complained about having to explain permanent death to their children while watching a cartoon. Longtime fans felt betrayed by what seemed like a cruel stunt designed purely for shock value. The writers defended the decision initially, claiming they wanted to remind viewers that Family Guy was still a show where anything could happen, despite being on the air for over a decade. Producer Steve Callahan said in interviews that the idea to kill Brian caught fire in the writer's room, and they saw it as a fun way to shake things up. Seth MacFarlane later admitted they were surprised by how angry people got, saying they thought it would create a stir, but didn't count on the rage. But here's the thing. The entire time, the writers knew Brian was coming back. Only 2 episodes later, in Christmas Guy, Stewie encounters a past version of himself at a toy store who still has a working time machine. Stewie uses it to go back and save Brian from being hit by the car, undoing the death completely. Everything goes back to normal. Vinny disappears without explanation, and Brian returns as if nothing happened. Looking back, the whole arc was a manipulation. The writers deliberately made fans believe Brian was permanently dead, let them grieve and rage for weeks, then brought him back in time for Christmas, as if they were doing everyone a favor, MacFarlane framed it as a lesson about appreciating what you have before it's gone, saying the experience would make fans value Brian more. But to many, it felt like emotional torture disguised as a teaching moment. The disturbing aspect isn't just the manipulation, though. It's what Brian's death and resurrection reveal about how Family Guy treats mortality and consequences. In the show's reality, death is apparently reversible through time travel, but only when the writers decide it should be. Characters have died and stayed dead, like Mr. Weed in the early seasons, or James Woods in later ones. But a main character, that death can be undone with time travel technology that Stewie supposedly destroyed. This raises uncomfortable questions about the show's internal logic. If Stewie could time travel to save Brian, why didn't he save all the people who died in previous episodes? Why doesn't he use time travel to fix every problem? The answer seems to be that the rules of Family Guy's universe change based on whatever the writers need for that particular episode. There is no consistent reality and no actual consequences, no meaningful stakes. Some fans developed a darker theory about Brian's death. They suggest that the Brian who came back isn't the same Brian who died. When Stewie time traveled to prevent the car accident, he didn't resurrect the Brian who died. He prevented that Brian from dying in the first place, creating a branching timeline. The Brian who bled out on the operating table, who said goodbye to his family, who experienced those final moments of fear and pain, that Brian is still dead. The Brian we see now is technically a different version from an alternate timeline who never went through that trauma. This interpretation makes the whole incident even more disturbing. The family grieved for a Brian who is genuinely dead and gone, and then accepted a replacement Brian, without questioning whether he's really the same dog they lost. From their perspective, their Brian came back. But from a timeline perspective, they're living with a copy who happens to have the same memories up until the divergence point. The Brian death arc also revealed something ugly about the relationship between the show and its audience. The writers knew exactly how much fans loved Brian, and they weaponized that love for ratings and publicity. The episode generated massive viewership, social media engagement, and news coverage. In purely business terms, it was a huge success, but it came at the cost of making fans feel manipulated and distrustful of future storylines. What makes this particularly disturbing is how it fits into a larger pattern of Family Guy toying with its audience's emotions without earning those emotional moments. The show built its reputation on irreverent humor that didn't take anything seriously, then suddenly demanded viewers take Brian's death seriously, then revealed it was all a joke anyway. It's emotional whiplash designed to generate attention rather than tell a meaningful story. The whole incident also highlights how Family Guy has become increasingly desperate for relevance and attention as it's aged. When you've been on the air for over 2 decades and have exhausted most conventional storylines, you start reaching for bigger and more shocking twists. Killing a beloved main character is the kind of move you make when you're running out of ideas and need to prove you're still bold and unpredictable. Some fans saw the Brian death as the moment Family Guy jumped the shark, the point where the show's cynicism and attention-seeking overwhelmed whatever heart and creativity it once had. Others saw it as just another example of the show's willingness to go anywhere for a laugh or a gasp. But everyone agreed it left a bad taste, a feeling that the show had crossed a line from dark comedy into emotional manipulation. The legacy of Brian's death is complicated. On one hand, it proved that Family Guy could generate massive cultural conversation and emotional investment from its audience. on the other hand, and it burned a lot of goodwill and made fans less willing to trust the show with serious moments. When you fake out death for publicity, you lose the ability to make death meaningful when you actually want to tell a serious story. The most disturbing aspect might be what it says about how the show views its own characters. To the writers, Brian isn't a character with agency or meaning beyond what serves their current story needs. He can die if that's shocking and interesting, then come back if that's convenient. He exists purely as a tool for generating content and reactions, not as a coherent character with a meaningful narrative arc. This instrumentalization of characters for shock value extends beyond just Brian. It reflects how Family Guy has come to treat all its characters as puppets to be broken and repaired at will, yet with no genuine consequences or character development. They exist in a nightmare loop where horrible things happen to them, but nothing ever really changes or matters, because next week's episode will reset everything back to the status quo. Stewie's fractured mind. Inside the perception of a psychotic genius. Let's dive into the most complex and disturbing character in Family Guy, the one who might actually be the key to understanding everything wrong with the show's reality. Stewie Griffin, the football-headed baby with a British accent and a nuclear arsenal, is far more than just a cute villain baby. He's potentially a deeply disturbed child whose fractured perception might be creating the entire reality we see on screen. From a purely clinical perspective, Stewie exhibits virtually every symptom of oppositional defiant disorder. He displays constant negativity, hostility, and defiant behavior lasting far beyond the normal 6-month diagnostic window. He loses his temper frequently, argues with authority figures constantly, actively defies adults' requests and rules, deliberately annoys people, blames others for his mistakes, gets easily annoyed, shows persistent anger and resentment, and demonstrates spiteful and vindictive behavior on a regular basis. But oppositional defiant disorder doesn't even begin to cover the extent of Stewie's issues. He also shows clear signs of antisocial personality disorder, which manifests in his complete lack of remorse for harming others, his deceitfulness, his failure to plan ahead despite his supposed genius, and his persistent aggressive behavior. Stewie has shot his mother Lois multiple times and built weapons of mass destruction, tortured people for minor infractions, and casually murdered countless individuals without showing any guilt or empathy. The disturbing part is how the show treats Stewie's violent tendencies. In early seasons, his plans to kill Lois and take over the world were played for laughs because he was a baby who couldn't possibly succeed. But as the show progressed, Stewie actually became capable of extreme violence. He built a fully functional multiverse traveling device, created time machines that actually work, developed weapons that can genuinely kill people, and demonstrated intelligence that far surpasses adult humans. Yet he's still treated as a baby that nobody takes seriously. This disconnect creates a deeply unsettling dynamic. Stewie has the physical form of a 1-year-old infant, but the intellectual capacity to reshape reality itself, combined with the emotional regulation of someone with severe personality disorders. He's essentially an omnipotent psychopath, trapped in a baby's body, and most of his family either doesn't notice or doesn't care about the danger he represents. But here's where fan theories get really interesting. Some viewers have proposed an interpretation where everything we see in Family Guy might actually be Stewie's perception of reality, filtered through his disturbed mind. If we examine the show through this lens, it could explain why the show's internal logic is so inconsistent, and why different characters seem to exist in different realities simultaneously. Consider how this theory interprets the family dynamics. Peter and Chris appear as complete buffoon to Stewie, which under this interpretation means he perceives them as aggressively stupid men incapable of basic reasoning. Lois is strict and controlling from a baby's perspective, so Stewie sees her as a tyrannical figure he must destroy. Meg is largely ignored by Stewie, so she barely registers in his perception, except as a target for abuse. Brian is the only one who treats Stewie as an equal and engages with him on an intellectual level, so Stewie perceives him as another intelligent being capable of speech and complex thought. This theory explains one of the show's biggest mysteries. Why can Stewie and Brian understand each other perfectly, having full conversations and going on adventures together, while other characters either can't understand Stewie at all, or only hear him as baby noises? According to this fan interpretation, Brian's ability to communicate with Stewie isn't because Brian is special. It's because Stewie perceives Brian as worthy of communication. So in Stewie's reality, Brian can understand him. Supporters of this theory point to how reality itself seems to bend around Stewie's experiences. His time machine works. His multiverse remote functions perfectly. His weapons cause real damage, and his inventions consistently defy the laws of physics. But other characters' technology rarely works as intended unless Stewie is involved. It's almost as if Stewie's belief that something will work makes it work within his perceived reality. There's also the question of Stewie's conversations with his teddy bear Rupert. Stewie treats Rupert as a fully sentient being capable of understanding complex philosophical discussions. He has genuine emotional attachments to Rupert and becomes violent when anyone threatens the stuffed animal. This isn't normal play behavior. It's dissociation, creating an imaginary companion that Stewie perceives as real. When someone tears or damages Rupert, Stewie's reaction isn't proportional disappointment. It's genuine anguish and rage, as if a real person has been harmed. He's not pretending Rupert is alive for fun. In his mind, Rupert genuinely is alive and deserving of protection. This level of disconnection from reality suggests severe psychological issues that go way beyond typical childhood imagination. And the show has also hinted at dissociative identity disorder through Stewie's rapidly shifting personalities and behaviors. One episode might show him as an evil genius focused on world domination. The next as a cultured sophisticate discussing theatre and fine wine. Then as a vulnerable child seeking maternal comfort. Then as a violent psychopath torturing someone for amusement. While the show presents these as character inconsistencies for comedic effect, fans analyzing Stewie's behavior have suggested these could represent different personalities existing within the same fractured mind. Stewie's relationship with violence is particularly disturbing because it shows no progression or learning. Most children, even those with behavioral disorders, eventually develop some capacity for empathy and understanding consequences. And Stewie has been a baby for over 2 decades of episodes, and he's shown zero growth in his ability to care about other people's suffering. He tortures Brian's family, destroys property without remorse, kills people casually, and shows no signs of developing a conscience. In the episode where Stewie created evil Stewie, his own clone became so violent and dangerous that even Stewie was horrified. But the episode treats this as if Stewie is somehow different from his evil clone, when in reality, Stewie regularly demonstrates the same level of cruelty and lack of empathy. The evil clone isn't an aberration. It's Stewie looking at himself in a mirror and being disturbed by what he sees. There's also disturbing evidence that Stewie's intelligence might not be as real as it appears. His inventions work within the context of Family Guy's reality, but they shouldn't be possible for anyone, let alone a 1-year-old. The time machine violates every known law of physics. The multiverse remote requires technology that doesn't exist. His weapons operate on principles that couldn't function in the real world. This suggests that Stewie's genius might actually be delusion, elaborate fantasies that he believes are real, and that Family Guy's distorted reality allows to manifest. Consider the possibility that Stewie is actually a severely disturbed child with oppositional defiant disorder and antisocial personality disorder, experiencing elaborate delusions about being a genius with world-conquering technology. Everything we see could be his distorted perception of reality, where his tantrums become plots to kill his mother, his play with toys becomes world domination schemes, and his inability to connect with others becomes intellectual superiority. This interpretation makes Stewie's adventures with Brian particularly tragic. Brian might engage with Stewie's delusions because he's the family dog and has been trained to be patient with the baby, or because he's also dealing with his own issues and finds escape in playing along with Stewie's fantasies. The time travel adventures, multiverse explorations, and elaborate schemes might all be happening in Stewie's mind, while Brian humors him, or they might be heavily distorted perceptions of much more mundane events. The sexual confusion that Stewie displays throughout the series adds another layer to his psychological profile. He's been shown attracted to women, men, and seemingly everything in between, but never in ways that feel like genuine sexuality. Instead, his responses seem like a child who doesn't understand sexuality at all, grasping at concepts he's observed but can't truly comprehend. His attempt at conversion therapy in the Family Guy episode suggests deep confusion about his own identity. What makes Stewie truly disturbing isn't just his violence or his delusions. It's the combination of infantile vulnerability and godlike power, psychological disorders and genius-level intelligence, desperate need for love, and complete inability to form healthy attachments. He represents something fundamentally broken, a mind that developed wrong from the very beginning and has only gotten more fractured over time. The most horrifying aspect of Stewie's character is what he implies about the world of Family Guy itself. If we're seeing everything through his distorted perception, then nothing we witness can be trusted as real. The abuse Meg suffers might be Stewie's interpretation of normal sibling rivalry. Peter's stupidity might be a baby's perception of adult behavior he doesn't understand. The violence and chaos might be how Stewie processes a world that makes no sense to his developing and damaged brain. And if Stewie is creating this reality through his perception, then every horrible thing that happens in the show is ultimately his fault. The abuse, the violence, the suffering of every character becomes a reflection of a deeply disturbed child's inability to process the world in a healthy way. The entire show becomes one long portrait of a severely mentally ill baby trying and failing to make sense of existence. There's also the chilling possibility that Stewie's perception is deliberately dark because he's actively traumatized. Young children who experience abuse or neglect often develop the exact disorders Stewie displays. His obsession with killing Lois could represent a baby's confusion about maternal rejection or inconsistent care. His need for weapons and control could stem from feeling powerless and vulnerable. His inability to connect with others could result from attachment disorders caused by inadequate bonding. If this is true, then Family Guy isn't just a comedy about a wacky family. It's a horror show about a traumatized infant retreating into increasingly violent delusions as a coping mechanism, creating a distorted reality where he has power and control because the real world offers him neither. and every episode becomes evidence of a child's psychological deterioration, documented in real time and played for laughs. The tragedy is that Stewie will never get help. He exists in a show that resets every week, where character development is sacrificed for gags, where psychological issues are comedy material rather than actual problems requiring intervention. He's trapped in a loop of his own fractured perception, creating and recreating a nightmare world where nothing is real and nothing matters, where violence has no consequences and love is impossible, where he'll be a disturbed baby forever with no hope of healing or growth. Peter's decaying brain. The mental institution theory. Now we need to talk about the theory that recontextualizes the entire show into something genuinely disturbing. The theory that Peter Griffin isn't a free man living in Quahog with his family, but is actually a patient in a mental institution who lost his mind after his entire family died, and everything we see is happening inside his deteriorating brain. Let's start with the evidence from the show itself. In Season 4, Episode 6, titled Petarded, Peter takes an IQ test after Lois lets him win a Trivial Pursuit by giving him questions from a preschool set. Convinced he's a genius, Peter demands to take a real IQ test. The results devastate him. Peter Griffin is clinically mentally retarded, with an IQ so low he qualifies for legal disability status. The show plays this for laughs, but it's establishing something important. Peter's brain genuinely doesn't work properly. Throughout the series, we see Peter sustain massive brain injuries. He's had his skull crushed, his brain exposed, portions of his brain destroyed, and suffered countless concussions and traumatic impacts. In one episode, the camera goes inside Peter's head to reveal his last functioning brain cell desperately trying to keep him alive while surrounded by dead cells. This isn't subtle foreshadowing. It's explicit confirmation that Peter's brain is severely damaged and getting worse. The show has repeatedly demonstrated that Peter's intelligence and mental capacity have declined over time. In early seasons, Peter was dim-witted but capable of complex thought, genuine emotion, and learning from mistakes. As the series progressed, he became increasingly stupid, impulsive, and disconnected from consequences. His behavior shifted from lovably foolish to genuinely psychopathic, as showing no empathy for the people he hurts and no memory of his previous actions. This is where fan speculation diverges from established canon. According to a popular Reddit theory posted in 2012 that later went viral on TikTok in 2022, proponents of this interpretation suggest the real Peter Griffin was an intelligent, caring father and husband who experienced unimaginable tragedy. Under this theory's narrative, his daughter Meg was a beautiful, popular teenager who got into a drunk driving accident one night while taking her intellectually disabled brother Chris to a party. Both children died in the crash. The theory continues by proposing that Lois, who was pregnant with Stewie at the time, couldn't handle the grief and committed suicide, taking her unborn child with her. Peter, left alone with 3 dead family members and no way to process such catastrophic loss, had a complete mental breakdown. According to this interpretation, he went insane and created an alternate reality where his family is still alive. Supporters of this theory point to specific character dynamics as evidence. Under this reading, Meg is no longer the beautiful, popular girl he lost. She's awkward and hated because Peter resents her for driving drunk and causing the accident that destroyed everything. His subconscious punishes her through constant abuse and rejection, making her the scapegoat for his anger and grief. Every cruel thing Peter does to Meg is his mind trying to process his fury at losing his real daughter to her mistake. Chris, who was mentally disabled due to oxygen deprivation at birth in the real world, becomes a simple but functional character in Peter's delusion. Peter feels guilty that he couldn't protect Chris, so he imagines a version of his son who is alive and safe, even if he's still intellectually limited. The guilt manifests as Peter's generally kinder treatment of Chris compared to Meg. Stewie, who Peter never got to meet, becomes an idealized super genius in Peter's mind. Peter had such high hopes for his unborn son that he imagines Stewie as having unlimited potential and intelligence, capable of anything. But Peter's anger at Lois for leaving him bleeds through, which is why Stewie constantly tries to kill Lois in his delusions. Stewie represents both Peter's hopes for what could have been and his rage at what was taken from him. Lois exists in Peter's delusion as the wife he lost, but filtered through his grief and anger, and sometimes she's supportive and loving, reflecting Peter's happy memories. Other times, she's critical and dismissive, representing Peter's subconscious belief that she abandoned him through suicide. The inconsistency in Lois's character isn't bad writing. It's Peter's conflicted feelings about the woman he loved who left him alone. Brian, the family dog, represents Peter's only remaining real connection to the outside world. In reality, Brian might be an actual service dog or therapy animal that visits Peter at the institution, or he could represent a real friend who comes to see Peter and tries to help him. In Peter's delusion, Brian becomes human-like because Peter needs someone he can really talk to, someone who can be his intellectual equal when Lois isn't there. Under this theory's interpretation, the neighbors play specific roles in Peter's delusion as well. Joe Swanson, perhaps described by Peter's visitors as a strong, heroic family man, in reality, becomes Peter's ideal of the father and husband he wished he could have been in the delusion. Joe is everything Peter feels he failed to be. He's brave, dedicated to his family, and admirable despite being paralyzed. Joe represents who Peter thinks could have saved his family, if only he'd been better. Cleveland Brown appears in Peter's delusion as his best friend, but according to this theory's interpretation, something shifts. Cleveland, who might have been a real friend who visited Peter regularly at the institution, eventually stops coming as often because indulging in Peter's delusion was making Cleveland lose touch with reality too. Under this reading, this is why the Cleveland show happened. In Peter's mind, Cleveland leaves Quahog because Peter subconsciously recognizes that his friend can't be around his insanity anymore. Quagmire represents Peter's awareness of his own dark impulses and desires that he can't acknowledge directly. Quagmire is perverted, selfish, and morally corrupt, traits that Peter might fear he possesses but projects onto this character instead. When Quagmire expresses hatred for Brian, it might represent Peter's self-hatred, directed at his only real connection to reality. Proponents of this theory suggest it explains why Peter constantly puts himself and his family through increasingly absurd and dangerous situations. According to this interpretation, in real life, Peter failed to protect his family from tragedy. In his delusion, he recreates dangerous scenarios over and over, but this time everyone survives. The car crashes, explosions, murders, and disasters all end with the family intact, because under this reading, Peter's mind is desperately trying to rewrite history, where he saves everyone instead of losing them. This lens also provides a framework for understanding why there are never real consequences. Peter can destroy property, hurt people, break laws, and cause chaos without facing genuine repercussions because, if the theory holds, none of it is real. It's all happening in his mind, where he controls the outcomes. Every episode where the family faces danger and survives is Peter's psyche working through his trauma by reimagining scenarios where he succeeds at keeping everyone alive. The timeline inconsistencies and reality-bending moments in Family Guy support this theory. Characters' personalities shift wildly, major events are forgotten by the next episode, and the rules of the universe change constantly because we're watching the fluid, unreliable construct of a delusional mind. Peter's brain can't maintain consistent reality because he's not constructing a real world. He's improvising comfort fantasies that shift based on his emotional state. The show's increasing cruelty and darkness over time might represent Peter's mental state deteriorating. As years pass in the institution, his delusions become more violent and disturbing because his mind is breaking down further. The early seasons were closer to the reality he lost, but as time goes on and his brain damage accumulates, the delusion corrupts into something nastier and more chaotic. The fourth wall breaks suddenly make horrible sense. When characters acknowledge they're in a TV show, it might be Peter's awareness bleeding through. Moments where he half recognizes that none of this is real. But he can't fully face that truth, so he frames it as jokes about being cartoon characters instead of confronting the reality that he's insane and his family is dead. The cutaway gags represent Peter's fragmenting mind jumping between different thoughts and memories, unable to maintain focus on a single narrative. His brain careens from one tangential idea to another, creating these bizarre non sequiturs that interrupt the main story. It's not creative comedy structure. It's the thought pattern of someone whose mind can't follow a linear path anymore. What makes this theory particularly disturbing is imagining Peter's real situation. He's likely heavily medicated, probably restrained at times, possibly barely verbal in the real world, while these elaborate delusions play out in his mind. The visitors who occasionally come see him and play along with his delusions about Cleveland and Joe, trying to keep him calm and connected to something, even if that something is false. The staff at the institution might allow Peter to maintain his delusions because the alternative, forcing him to confront that his entire family is dead and has been for years, might destroy what little remains of his mind. It's kinder to let him live in a fantasy where they're still alive, even if that fantasy is increasingly dark and disturbed. Cleveland's departure from the show becomes tragic in this context. To Cleveland, a real friend trying to help Peter, eventually couldn't take it anymore. Watching Peter lose himself deeper and deeper into insanity, being asked to participate in increasingly delusional conversations, taking a toll on Cleveland's own mental health. He had to step back for his own sake, leaving Peter more isolated and causing the delusion to fill that gap with a narrative about Cleveland moving away. The theory suggests that when Cleveland returned to Family Guy after the Cleveland show ended, it represents Cleveland trying again to reach his old friend, coming back to visit Peter at the institution after taking time to recover himself. But Peter's too far gone now, and Cleveland realizes his friend is never coming back. There's also the possibility that the institution itself has given up on Peter getting better, or maybe they know he'll never recover, that his brain is too damaged and his trauma too severe, so they just keep him comfortable and let him live in whatever reality his mind creates. The delusion is permanent, and Peter will spend the rest of his life in this fictional quahog he's constructed, surrounded by ghosts of the family he couldn't save. The most horrifying implication is that Peter might have some dim awareness of the truth buried deep in his subconscious. The way he treats Meg might be his mind's way of punishing himself through her, expressing his self-hatred by creating a character who receives the abuse he feels he deserves. Meg's suffering becomes Peter's psychological self-flagellation, hurting her because she represents his failure. If we accept this theory, then every episode of Family Guy becomes a document of progressive insanity. We're watching a man's mind collapse in slow motion, documenting his descent into madness disguised as comedy. The increasingly outlandish premises and darker humor aren't the writers running out of ideas. They're accurately representing how Peter's delusion is degrading as his brain damage accumulates and his trauma remains unprocessed. The show will never end with Peter getting better because he can't get better. His family is dead, his brain is destroyed, and the reality he's created is the only thing keeping him from complete catatonia. Family Guy will continue as long as Fox wants it to, because Peter's delusion will continue until his damaged brain finally gives out completely. In this theory transforms Family Guy from an edgy animated comedy into something genuinely tragic and disturbing. Every laugh becomes mocking a severely mentally ill man trapped in his own mind. Every outrageous moment becomes evidence of psychological deterioration. Every episode where the family survives against impossible odds becomes a desperate fantasy of a man who couldn't save the people he loved in real life, so he saves them over and over in his mind, where he still has control. Meg's systematic abuse. The scapegoat theory. Now we need to address the elephant in the room, or rather, the daughter everyone pretends doesn't exist. Meg Griffin represents one of the most disturbing aspects of Family Guy, because her treatment goes beyond dark comedy into what genuinely resembles systematic abuse, documented and normalized for entertainment. So in early seasons of Family Guy, Meg was simply an awkward, unpopular teenager trying to fit in. She faced typical high school problems, had crushes, dealt with acne and weight concerns, and struggled with her parents' lack of understanding. The humor came from relatable teenage angst and the universal experience of feeling like an outsider. Meg was sympathetic, and viewers rooted for her to find happiness and acceptance. But something shifted dramatically as the show progressed. Meg transformed from a character whose struggles we empathized with into the designated punching bag for every other character's cruelty. Her family didn't just misunderstand her anymore. They actively hated her, mocked her, physically assaulted her, and went out of their way to make her life miserable. The catchphrase, "Shut up, I'm Meg," became shorthand for the family's complete dismissal of her humanity. Peter's treatment of Meg crosses lines that would constitute abuse in any real-world context. He's sold Meg to the Goldman family like property. He's thrown furniture and objects at her head. He's farted in her face repeatedly. He's asked God to remove Meg from existence. He's locked her in the trunk of his car. He's made her feel so worthless that she's developed suicidal tendencies that the show acknowledges but treats as comedy material. In one episode, Peter literally stands in a hallway with a baseball bat, waiting for Meg to come home, then clubs her unconscious the moment she appears without any explanation or provocation. This isn't played as Peter having gone crazy or needing intervention. It's just another day in the Griffin household, another example of casual violence against Meg treated as normal and funny. Lois isn't much better. While she's not as overtly violent as Peter, Lois constantly puts Meg down for her appearance, her social status, her lack of achievements, and her basic existence. Lois regularly compares Meg unfavorably to herself, steals Meg's moments of potential happiness, and makes it clear through her actions and words that she considers Meg a disappointing burden rather than a beloved daughter. There are episodes where Lois shows sympathy for Meg, particularly in earlier seasons, but these moments become increasingly rare. More often, Lois joins Peter in mocking Meg, ignores obvious signs that Meg is suffering, and fails to protect her daughter from the abuse she receives from other family members. Lois is complicit in Meg's mistreatment through both action and inaction. Chris and Stewie also participate in abusing Meg, though to lesser degrees. Chris often joins in mocking his sister, and in some episodes actively works to keep her miserable because her suffering benefits him somehow. Stewie treats Meg as beneath his notice most of the time, but when he does acknowledge her, it's usually to insult or humiliate her. Even Brian, who in early seasons would occasionally defend Meg or show her kindness, eventually becomes another person who dismisses and demeans her. The one character who should recognize Meg's intelligence and worth because he values those traits himself, instead treats her like the annoyance everyone else sees her as. The psychological impact of this sustained abuse on Meg is portrayed with disturbing accuracy for a comedy show. She has severe depression, anxiety, self-esteem issues, and suicidal ideation. She becomes obsessed with anyone who shows her the slightest kindness because she's so starved for affection and validation. She's kidnapped people, stalked men who were nice to her, and demonstrated increasingly disturbed behavior as direct results of the abuse she endures. In Season 8, Episode 6, Dial Meg for Murder, Meg emerges from a stint in a young offenders institution as a hardened criminal who terrorizes her family and beats up anyone who makes fun of her. For once, Meg is the one with power, and she uses it to make her abusers feel the fear and helplessness she's experienced for years. The family is terrified of her, and it's genuinely satisfying to watch them face consequences for their treatment of her. But the episode ends with Brian convincing Meg to go back to being the family's punching bag. He explains that the family needs Meg to be their outlet for negativity, their target for abuse, because without her serving that role, they turn on each other. Meg absorbs all the family's dysfunction and cruelty, preventing them from destroying themselves. Brian frames this as Meg being the glue holding the family together, as if being systematically abused is a noble sacrifice rather than a horrific situation she should escape. And Meg accepts this. She agrees to go back to being treated terribly for the supposed greater good of keeping her toxic family functional. The episode presents this as character growth, as Meg being mature and selfless. But what it actually depicts is a victim of abuse being convinced that her abuse is necessary and that she should accept it for everyone else's benefit. It's psychological manipulation masquerading as a heartwarming resolution. Season 10, Episode 7, Seahorse Seashell Party, shows Meg finally standing up for herself in a different way. After taking drugs that make her question her reality, Meg confronts Lois and Peter about their terrible parenting. She delivers a devastating speech listing all of Lois's flaws and failures as a mother, pointing out how Lois is far from perfect, yet constantly judges and degrades Meg for minor shortcomings. Lois breaks down crying, admitting she's been a terrible mother. But then the family starts falling apart without Meg to kick around. Peter and Lois fight. Chris becomes depressed, and the household descends into chaos. The episode makes the same disturbing point that Dial Meg for Murder made. Meg's abuse is necessary for the family to function. She's the lightning rod for all their negativity. By the end, Meg takes back everything she said and apologizes for standing up for herself. She accepts her role as the family scapegoat, convinced that her suffering serves a purpose. The episode treats this as Meg being wise and mature, but it's actually showing a victim of abuse being gaslit into believing her abuse is her responsibility to endure. What makes this particularly disturbing is how the show frames Meg's acceptance of abuse as positive character development. She's not learning to set boundaries or demand respect. She's learning to accept disrespect and abuse because other people can't handle their problems without using her as an emotional dumping ground. The show presents abuse enabling as maturity. The Meg abuse has gotten so extreme in later seasons that even some fans who enjoy dark comedy find it uncomfortable. When Meg is treated so badly for so long without relief or justice, it stops being funny and starts feeling genuinely cruel. There's no punchline to Meg's suffering. It's just sustained mistreatment of someone who doesn't deserve it, documented across hundreds of episodes. The show has made half-hearted attempts to address the Meg abuse, usually by having Meg temporarily stand up for herself before returning to the status quo, or by showing that the family supposedly loves her deep down despite treating her terribly. But these moments ring hollow when the very next episode will have Peter throwing something at Meg's head, or the entire family forgetting her birthday or deliberately excluding her from family activities. There's also the disturbing element that Meg's abuse extends beyond her family. At school, she's bullied relentlessly. In her attempts to date, she's humiliated and rejected. Even strangers treat her with contempt for no apparent reason. The entire world of Family Guy has decided that Meg deserves abuse, and the show never questions this or suggests it's wrong. It simply is, and Meg must accept it. Some fans have theorized that Meg's treatment connects to Peter's insanity theory. If everything is Peter's delusion, then Meg represents his guilt over his real daughter dying in a drunk driving accident. He can't forgive himself, so he creates a Meg who suffers constantly as punishment. Every cruel thing Peter does to Meg is his subconscious trying to hurt himself for failing to save his real daughter. This interpretation makes the Meg abuse even darker because it means we're watching a man psychologically torture a stand-in for his dead child because he can't process his grief in a healthy way. Meg becomes the recipient of Peter's self-hatred, suffering because the real Meg made a fatal mistake, and Peter's broken mind can't stop punishing her memory for it. But even without the insanity theory, Meg's treatment is disturbing because of what it says about how Family Guy treats its characters. The show decided early on that Meg would be the butt of jokes, and as the writing became lazier and meaner, those jokes evolved into genuine abuse. The writers created a character who exists solely to suffer, gave her realistic psychological trauma from that suffering, then made her accept that suffering as necessary. This sends a terrible message to viewers who identify with Meg. If you're an outsider, if you don't fit in, if your family treats you badly, the show suggests you should accept that treatment rather than fight against it, or remove yourself from abusive situations. Meg's story teaches that some people are meant to be everyone's punching bag, and the mature thing to do is accept your designated role rather than demand better treatment. In recent seasons, the show has slightly backed off the Meg abuse, occasionally giving her moments of triumph or showing family members being kind to her. But these feel like too little too late after years of normalized mistreatment. And Meg has been defined by her abuse for so long that it's become inseparable from her character identity. The most disturbing aspect might be how Meg's abuse reflects real-world scapegoating dynamics in dysfunctional families. In families with untreated trauma, addiction, or mental health issues, one member often becomes the designated problem child who absorbs blame for everything wrong. Family Guy portrays this dynamic with uncomfortable accuracy, then frames it as comedy and ultimately suggests the scapegoat should accept their role. Meg Griffin deserves better than what Family Guy has given her. She deserves a storyline where she escapes her toxic family, builds a life away from their abuse, and finds genuine happiness and respect. She deserves justice for years of documented mistreatment. Instead, she's trapped in a show that resets every week, forcing her to endure the same cycle of abuse with no growth, no escape, and no hope that things will ever improve. The fact that this abuse is played for laughs, that "shut up Meg" became a pop culture catchphrase, that people say it to voice actress Mila Kunis in real life, shows how normalized and celebrated Meg's abuse has become. We're supposed to find a teenage girl being systematically degraded by everyone in her life funny. And that's perhaps the most disturbing thing of all. Quagmire's darkness. Predatory behavior, normalized. Let's talk about Glenn Quagmire, a character who represents some of Family Guy's most disturbing content, disguised as comic relief. Quagmire is introduced as Peter's oversexed neighbor, whose catchphrase, "giggity," punctuates his constant pursuit of sexual encounters. On the surface, he seems like a typical sitcom horndog character, the neighborhood lech played for laughs. But when you actually examine Quagmire's behavior across the series, a genuinely disturbing pattern emerges. Quagmire isn't just a guy who loves sex. He's a predator whose actions, if they occurred in real life, would result in numerous arrests for sexual assault, rape, and solicitation of minors. The show treats these behaviors as quirky personality traits, rather than serious crimes. Quagmire has explicitly stated on multiple occasions that he doesn't care about consent. He's drugged women to have sex with them. He's had sex with unconscious women. He's deliberately gotten women drunk so they'd sleep with him. He's hidden cameras in women's bathrooms and bedrooms. He's kidnapped women and held them captive. These aren't jokes about being too forward on dates. These are descriptions of actual rape. In Season 8, Episode 3, Quagmire's Mom, the episode deals with statutory rape in a way that's disturbing even by Family Guy standards. Quagmire has sex with a girl who he learns afterward is underage. Instead of the episode treating this as the serious crime it is, Quagmire's main concern is whether he knew her age beforehand. The show frames it as an unfortunate mishap, rather than a grown man sexually assaulting a minor. The Parents Television Council filed formal complaints about this episode, citing sexually explicit dialogue and jokes about statutory rape, and they were right to be disturbed. The episode doesn't condemn Quagmire's actions or show him facing meaningful consequences. It treats the statutory rape of a teenager as just another wacky Quagmire adventure, complete with jokes and his signature giggity. Quagmire's sexuality isn't just aggressive or indiscriminate. It's actively predatory and often involves people who cannot consent. He's had sex with unconscious women at parties. He's described elaborate schemes to drug women's drinks. He's talked about his rape van. He keeps unconscious women in his basement. He films women without their knowledge or consent. He expresses sexual interest in underage girls repeatedly throughout the series. In the episode Meg and Quagmire, Quagmire attempts to have sex with 18-year-old Meg, which is legal but deeply inappropriate, given that he's known her since she was a baby and is her father's best friend. When Peter finds out, his concern isn't that his supposed best friend is a predator who tried to sleep with his teenage daughter. His concern is maintaining the friendship, and he ultimately apologizes to Quagmire. This sends a horrifying message about male friendship superseding the protection of young women from predatory older men. Quagmire actively pursued someone he watched grow up, someone who was vulnerable and desperate for affection. And the show treats Peter's anger about this as the problem to be solved, rather than Quagmire's predatory behavior. Quagmire's house is essentially a crime scene waiting to be discovered. He has hidden bondage equipment, cameras, and rooms specifically designed for sexually assaulting women. He's shown to have sex with women who are clearly incapacitated and cannot consent. The show plays these details for shock humor, as if the outrageous extremes of Quagmire's sexual deviance make it funny rather than horrifying. What makes this particularly disturbing is that Quagmire is portrayed as one of the good guys. He's Peter's friend, Joe's friend, part of the core group of characters we're supposed to like and root for. He has episodes where he's the hero, where he shows depth and emotion, where other characters defend him or support him. The show wants us to overlook his constant sexual assault and predation because he's funny and loyal to his friends. The episode Jerome is the New Black shows Quagmire's racism toward Peter's new black friend, revealing another layer to his character's ugliness. But even his racism is treated as more problematic than his sexual assault. The show is more concerned with condemning Quagmire's bigotry than his predation, as if racism is where we draw the line, but rape is just Quagmire being Quagmire. Quagmire's hatred of Brian, while often providing entertaining conflict, also reveals disturbing aspects of his character. In Season 8, Episode 7, Jerome is the New Black, Quagmire delivers a long speech explaining why he hates Brian, listing Brian's flaws and hypocrisies. Many of his criticisms are valid. Brian is pretentious, self-absorbed, and treats women badly. But the irony is that Quagmire criticizes Brian for hitting on Lois and treating women poorly, while Quagmire himself is a literal rapist who shows far less respect for women than Brian ever has. Quagmire calls Brian out for being a bad person, while being objectively worse in every measurable way. The show seems to think Quagmire's criticism is valid and doesn't acknowledge the massive hypocrisy of a sexual predator lecturing anyone about morality. This is part of Family Guy's disturbing tendency to normalize certain types of behavior while condemning others based on inconsistent moral standards. Brian's pursuit of Lois is treated as creepy and wrong, but Quagmire's actual assault of countless women is treated as a running gag. The show's moral compass is completely broken, condemning relatively minor infractions while celebrating genuinely horrific crimes. In real life, Quagmire would be in prison. He would be a registered sex offender. He would be persona non grata in any civilized community. But in Family Guy, he's a beloved neighbor, a pilot with a responsible job, and a valued friend. Nobody reports his crimes, nobody refuses to associate with him, and nobody seems concerned that he's a danger to every woman in Quahog. The episode Quagmire's Quagmire addresses domestic abuse, but in Quagmire's case, he's the victim rather than the perpetrator. He dates a woman named Sonia, who turns out to be violently abusive toward him. This episode could have been an opportunity to show that Quagmire's attitude toward women has consequences, or to explore how his predatory behavior might stem from his own trauma, where instead, the episode treats Quagmire being abused as karmic justice for unrelated character flaws, and when his friends rescue him, he admits he likes being in control in relationships, which is played as a punchline rather than an admission of his controlling and predatory nature. The episode comes close to acknowledging Quagmire's problems, but ultimately treats domestic abuse as comedy and resolves nothing about his character. Season 8, Episode 18, Quagmire's Dad, deals with transgender issues through Quagmire's father Dan, coming out as a transgender woman named Ida. The episode is widely criticized for transphobic content, particularly the scene where Brian vomits extensively after learning he had sex with a transgender woman. The episode wants credit for including a transgender character while making that character the butt of cruel jokes. What's disturbing is that this episode about accepting a transgender parent is more concerned with Brian's reaction to learning about Ida's gender identity than with any real exploration of transgender issues or Quagmire's relationship with his father. Even in an episode supposedly about family and acceptance, the show can't resist making transgender identity a source of revulsion and comedy. Quagmire represents how Family Guy handles sexual assault and predatory behavior. The show acknowledges that what Quagmire does is wrong by occasionally making jokes about him going to prison or being a sex offender, but it never treats these crimes as actual crimes deserving genuine consequences. Yet Quagmire continues to assault women week after week, year after year, with no meaningful repercussions. This normalization of sexual predation is particularly disturbing in a show that millions of people watch, including teenagers and young adults who are learning about sexual dynamics and consent. Family Guy presents a character who drugs women, films them without consent, has sex with unconscious people, and targets underage girls, then frames him as a lovable rogue rather than a dangerous criminal. The message this sends is that sexual assault is funny if the perpetrator is charming enough, that women's autonomy and consent don't really matter, and that predatory behavior toward women is just a personality quirk, rather than a serious violation worthy of consequences. This isn't edgy comedy pushing boundaries. It's normalizing rape culture under the guise of irreverent humor. Some viewers argue that Quagmire is supposed to be a criticism of toxic masculinity and rape culture, that the show is satirizing these behaviors by making Quagmire so extreme. But satire requires some indication that the behavior is being condemned, some sense that the audience is supposed to recognize it as wrong. Family Guy presents Quagmire's predation without judgment, without consequences, and often with approval from other characters. If Quagmire was meant to be a villain, whose behavior we're supposed to find reprehensible, the show wouldn't present him as Peter's friend and confidant, wouldn't give him heroic moments, wouldn't let him deliver moral lectures to other characters. And the show treats Quagmire as a fundamentally good person, who just happens to be a serial rapist, as if those things can coexist without contradiction. The most disturbing aspect of Quagmire's character is what his continued presence and popularity says about our culture's blind spots regarding sexual assault. That a character whose defining trait is sexually assaulting women can be beloved by fans, can be featured prominently in merchandise, can be treated as comic relief rather than a monster, reveals how normalized and minimized sexual violence against women has become in popular culture. Quagmire should horrify us. Instead, giggity became a catchphrase. His predatory behavior became fodder for family-friendly memes and references. The sexual assault of countless women became his signature character trait, I mentioned as casually as Homer Simpson's love of donuts or Peter Griffin's love of chicken fights. We turned a serial rapist into a lovable sitcom neighbor, and barely anyone questioned it. The chicken fights, reality-breaking violence. One of Family Guy's most iconic recurring segments is the extended fight scenes between Peter Griffin and Ernie the giant chicken. These battles have become legendary for their length, their destruction, and their complete disconnect from any sense of reality or consequences. But when you really think about what these fights represent and what they reveal about the show's universe, they become genuinely disturbing. The feud began, as revealed in the episode Da Boom, because Ernie gave Peter an expired coupon. That's it. A simple expired coupon sparked one of the longest and most destructive feuds in animation history. Peter attacked Ernie over this minor inconvenience, and the chicken fought back, beginning a cycle of violence that has lasted for over a decade and caused untold millions in property damage. Think about that origin for a moment. Peter Griffin attempted to murder someone with his bare hands because of an expired coupon. This is an exaggerated reaction played for laughs. Within the context of the show, Peter genuinely tried to kill Ernie, and Ernie responded with equivalent violence in self-defense. The entire feud is based on Peter being violently unhinged over something that barely qualifies as an inconvenience. The fights themselves escalate to absurd levels of destruction. Peter and Ernie crash through buildings, destroy vehicles, and cause explosions, and create chaos that would result in numerous civilian casualties if this happened in reality. They fought through hospitals, airports, restaurants, construction sites, and residential neighborhoods. They've destroyed property worth tens of millions of dollars. They've created situations that would absolutely result in innocent people dying from falling debris, explosions, or collateral damage. But Family Guy treats this as pure comedy. There are never any real consequences for the destruction. Peter doesn't get arrested for the property damage. He doesn't face lawsuits from the businesses and homeowners whose property he destroyed. He doesn't get charged with reckless endangerment or attempted murder. The fights happen, the episode ends, and by the next episode, everything is back to normal as if nothing happened. This reveals something fundamental about Family Guy's reality. Normal rules don't apply. Property damage doesn't matter. Human life doesn't matter. Violence doesn't have consequences as long as it's presented as a joke. The chicken fights exist in a space where nothing is real and nothing matters, where Peter can cause citywide destruction and walk away without facing any repercussions. The fights also demonstrate Peter's complete inability to let go of grievances. A normal person would be annoyed by an expired coupon, maybe complain to a manager, then move on with their life. Peter has held this grudge for years, attacking Ernie on sight and engaging in battles that last for minutes of screen time, representing hours or days of actual fighting. This isn't persistence or determination. It's obsessive and psychotic fixation on revenge for a minor slight. Ernie the giant chicken shows similar obsession, returning again and again to fight Peter despite being killed multiple times. The chicken survives falls from great heights, explosions, being crushed, being burned, and every other form of potential death. He's essentially immortal, always coming back for one more fight no matter how definitively he seemed to die in the previous encounter. This immortality suggests that Ernie might not be real at all. Some fans theorize that the giant chicken represents Peter's inner demons, his violent impulses given physical form. Every fight with the chicken is Peter battling his own worst instincts, which is why the chicken can never truly die. You can't kill your own shadow, and you can't permanently defeat the parts of yourself you're trying to suppress. In the episode Internal Affairs, it's revealed that Ernie has a wife named Nicole and a life beyond fighting Peter. This humanizes the chicken and makes Peter's attacks on him even more disturbing. Peter isn't just fighting a monstrous enemy. He's attempting to murder a family man who gave him an expired coupon years ago. The revelation that Ernie has loved ones waiting for him at home transforms the fights from cartoonish violence into Peter repeatedly trying to orphan someone's children over a coupon. The multiverse theory adds another layer to the chicken fights. In the video game, Family Guy, Back to the Multiverse, alternate versions of Ernie exist across different realities, and suggesting that the chicken Peter fights might not always be the same chicken. Peter could be attacking different versions of Ernie across multiple timelines, spreading his violence and obsession through the multiverse itself. This would explain Ernie's immortality and inconsistent backstory. Peter isn't fighting one chicken who won't stay dead. He's fighting different chickens from different realities, and each time one dies, another version shows up to continue the cycle. Peter's vendetta has become multiversal, transcending time and space in its obsessive need for revenge. The chicken fights also reveal how far Family Guy will go for spectacle at the expense of storytelling coherence. These fights often last several minutes, taking up significant portions of episodes while contributing nothing to the plot. They're pure violence and destruction, extended action sequences that exist solely to show how far the animation team can push the chaos. But there's something almost hypnotic about watching these fights. They escalate beyond anything reasonable, moving from location to location, incorporating increasingly ridiculous weapons and scenarios, pushing the boundaries of what animated violence can depict. They're excessive to the point of being surreal, so over the top that they disconnect from any sense of reality or consequence. This disconnect is precisely what makes them disturbing. The chicken fights represent Family Guy at its most nihilistic, presenting violence as pure spectacle divorced from meaning or consequence. It's not violence in the service of a story or character development. It's violence for its own sake, and escalating because escalation is entertaining, destroying because destruction is visually interesting. In Fecal Matters, Peter admits he actually enjoys fighting the chicken. What started as rage over an expired coupon has become something Peter looks forward to, a thrill he craves. The fights aren't about the coupon anymore. They've become a twisted relationship between Peter and Ernie, two individuals bound together by cycles of violence they've come to depend on. This transforms the chicken fights from mindless comedy into something darker. Peter and Ernie need each other now. They're locked in a cycle where neither can walk away, where every encounter must escalate beyond the last, where the violence has become its own justification. They're addicted to the fight, to the adrenaline, to the destruction, and unable or unwilling to break free. The fights also demonstrate how Family Guy has prioritized spectacle over substance. Early chicken fights were shocking because they were unexpected and brief. But as the show continued, the fights became longer and more elaborate, requiring more animation time and budget for diminishing returns. The shock value wore off, but the show kept escalating, trying to recapture that initial surprise through sheer excess. What we're left with is a pattern of behavior where Peter, upon seeing a giant chicken, drops everything to engage in extended combat that causes massive property damage and potentially kills innocent bystanders, all over a slight that happened years ago. This isn't a character we should root for or sympathize with, and this is a man with serious psychological problems who poses a genuine threat to public safety. The fact that these fights are played for laughs, that they're celebrated as one of Family Guy's signature elements, reveals how the show has normalized violence and destruction. We're supposed to find it funny that Peter is so obsessed and violent that he'll cause millions in damage and risk countless lives to attack a chicken over an expired coupon. We're supposed to enjoy the spectacle without questioning the implications, but the implications are genuinely disturbing. Peter Griffin is a violent, obsessive individual who cannot control his impulses, cannot let go of minor grievances, and cannot stop himself from causing massive destruction in pursuit of pointless revenge. He's a danger to everyone around him. And the show treats this as one of his endearing quirks, rather than evidence of severe mental illness requiring immediate intervention. The chicken fights exist in a consequence-free zone, where nothing Peter does matters, where he can cause any amount of destruction without facing repercussions, where his violence is celebrated rather than condemned. And that's perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all, the implicit message that violence is fine as long as it's entertaining, that destruction doesn't matter if it makes for good television, and that obsessive revenge is just another character trait rather than a serious problem requiring help. Controversial episodes that crossed every line. Family Guy has never shied away from controversy, but certain episodes went beyond edgy humor into territory that even longtime fans found deeply uncomfortable. These episodes weren't just offensive. They dealt with subjects in ways that seemed to mock real suffering, minimize serious issues, or promote genuinely harmful ideas. Let's examine the episodes that pushed boundaries so far that networks refused to air them and critics condemned them universally. Partial Terms of Endearment, Season 8, Episode 21, is the only Family Guy episode that has never aired on Fox and was completely banned from American television. The episode deals with abortion in a way that Fox executives deemed too controversial to broadcast, making it the most censored content in the show's history. The plot involves Lois being approached by her old college friend Naomi, who asks Lois to be a surrogate mother for her and her husband Dale. After some argument with Peter, Lois agrees and undergoes in vitro fertilization. However, while Lois is pregnant, Naomi and Dale are killed in a car accident, leaving Lois carrying a baby that has no biological parents anymore. The episode then presents both sides of the abortion debate. Peter initially opposes abortion, but gets convinced by a pro-life group, then switches sides after visiting a pro-choice rally. The back and forth continues as Lois struggles with whether to carry the pregnancy to term or terminate it. Eventually, Lois decides to have an abortion, and the episode shows her following through with that choice. Fox refused to air the episode, fearing backlash from both pro-life and pro-choice advocates, and network president Kevin Riley admitted the decision was largely financial, saying that abortion was such a hot-button issue that advertisers were reluctant to support the episode, and the potential controversy wasn't worth the risk during economically difficult times. The episode aired in the United Kingdom on BBC Three without controversy, and received generally positive reviews from critics who appreciated that the show actually picked a side, rather than copping out with a both sides are valid conclusion. But in America, the episode remains banned from television and is only available on the Season 8 DVD release. What makes Partial Terms of Endearment disturbing isn't the abortion content itself, but what its banning reveals about how American television handles controversial topics. A Family Guy has aired episodes featuring graphic violence, sexual assault jokes, and racist content without being banned. But an episode that treats abortion as a legitimate choice crossed a line that networks wouldn't allow. The implication is that violence and bigotry are more acceptable than women's reproductive choices. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, Season 3, Episode 22, was originally set to air in 2000, but was banned by Fox for 4 years due to concerns about anti-Semitism. The episode features Peter befriending a Jewish accountant named Max Weinstein, who helps solve Peter's financial problems. Impressed by Max's competence, Peter decides Chris should convert to Judaism to become smarter and more successful. The episode includes a song called I Need a Jew, parodying When You Wish Upon a Star from Pinocchio, where Peter sings about how Jews are magically good at managing money and solving problems. The lyrics play on stereotypes about Jewish people being inherently better with finances, framing it as if Peter admires these traits while simultaneously reducing an entire religious and ethnic group to a stereotype. Fox initially refused to air the episode, fearing it would be perceived as anti-Semitic despite the show's intentions to satirize Peter's ignorance rather than actually promote stereotypes. The episode eventually aired on Adult Swim in 2003 and finally on Fox in 2004, but the controversy surrounding it led to legal challenges. Bourne Company, which owns the rights to When You Wish Upon a Star, sued Fox for copyright infringement, arguing that I Need a Jew unlawfully copied their protected work. The lawsuit dragged on for years, with Bourne claiming the parody didn't qualify for fair use protections. Ultimately, U.S. District Judge Deborah Batts ruled in favor of Family Guy, stating that parodies of well-known songs are protected speech and that the whole point of parody is to mock the original. What's disturbing about this episode isn't just the stereotypes it perpetuates while claiming to satirize them, but how it represents Family Guy's common pattern of having things both ways. The show wants to make jokes based on ethnic stereotypes, while claiming those jokes are actually criticizing people who believe stereotypes. But the effect is the same. Viewers hear the stereotypes, laugh at them, and the stereotypes get reinforced regardless of the supposed satirical intent. Quagmire's Dad, Season 8, Episode 18, generated massive controversy for its handling of transgender issues. In this episode, Quagmire's father, Dan Quagmire, reveals he is a transgender woman and plans to undergo gender reassignment surgery, adopting the name Ida. What should have been an opportunity to handle transgender identity with sensitivity instead became one of the most transphobic episodes in mainstream television history. The episode's worst moment comes when Brian, who doesn't know Ida is transgender, has sex with her and later discovers her gender history. His reaction is to vomit extensively and violently for an extended period, as if having sex with a transgender woman is the most disgusting thing imaginable. This scene equates transgender identity with something inherently revolting and frames Brian's disgust as justified and understandable. And the episode also features extensive jokes about Ida's gender, treats her transition as something shocking and weird rather than a valid life choice, and generally frames transgender identity as something to be mocked. While writer Steve Callahan defended the episode by noting he based it on his own father's transition, critics pointed out that personal experience doesn't excuse transphobic content. Seth MacFarlane himself defended the episode, claiming it wasn't meant to be offensive, and that showing Brian's visceral reaction was honest rather than hateful. But the problem is that the episode never challenges Brian's revulsion, never suggests his reaction might be wrong, and never portrays Ida as anything other than a punchline. The transphobia isn't subtext. It's the entire point of the episode's humor. LGBTQ advocates and organizations condemned the episode, pointing out that media portrayals of transgender women as deceptive or disgusting contribute to real-world violence and discrimination against transgender people. Family Guy has enough cultural influence that an episode this openly transphobic has real consequences in terms of shaping attitudes and normalizing bigotry. Turban Cowboy, Season 11, Episode 15, became infamous not just for its content, but for its catastrophically bad timing. The episode features Peter befriending a Muslim man named Mahmoud and getting involved in Islamic culture. The plot includes terrorists planning to blow up a bridge, with Peter inadvertently helping them before realizing the plan and trying to escape. And the episode includes numerous insensitive jokes about Muslim culture and features a cutaway gag showing Peter running over pedestrians with a car during the Boston Marathon. This cutaway, which was meant to be random dark humor in Family Guy's typical style, became horrifying when the episode aired just weeks before the actual Boston Marathon bombing in 2013. The timing was pure coincidence. The episode was produced months before the bombing occurred. But the fact that Family Guy aired a joke about mass casualties at the Boston Marathon so close to when it actually happened created an extremely uncomfortable situation. Fox pulled the episode from future airings and removed the controversial scene from streaming versions. Conspiracy theorists claimed the episode predicted the bombing or proved Seth MacFarlane had foreknowledge of the attack, leading to MacFarlane having to publicly address the accusations and explain that the episode was produced long before the actual bombing. The entire incident revealed how Family Guy's reliance on shock humor and tragedy jokes can backfire spectacularly when real tragedies occur. Beyond the Boston Marathon connection, Turban Cowboy is genuinely Islamophobic in its portrayal of Muslim culture and terrorism. The episode conflates Islamic faith with extremism, presents Muslim characters as suspicious and potentially dangerous, and treats an entire religion and culture as material for crude jokes. Even without the Boston Marathon controversy, the episode would be deeply problematic. Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q. Season 10, Episode 3, attempts to tackle domestic violence, but does so in such a spectacularly misguided way that it becomes offensive to abuse survivors. The episode deals with Quagmire's sister Brenda, who is in an abusive relationship with her boyfriend Jeff. The episode shows Jeff hitting Brenda, verbally degrading her, and controlling every aspect of her life. Brenda makes excuses for him, claiming she loves him, and that he only hits her because he loves her too much. The gang tries to convince Brenda to leave Jeff, but she refuses, leading to a confrontation where Quagmire ultimately murders Jeff to protect his sister. Multiple problems make this episode deeply disturbing. First, Anya treats Brenda's inability to leave her abuser as a frustrating choice, rather than a complex psychological situation that abuse survivors face. The episode frames her as being stupid or weak for not leaving, rather than understanding the real barriers and trauma that make leaving abusive relationships incredibly difficult. Second, the episode's solution to domestic violence is murder. Quagmire kills Jeff, and this is presented as justified and even heroic. While abuse survivors might fantasize about their abusers dying, presenting murder as a legitimate solution to domestic violence is irresponsible and potentially dangerous messaging. Third, the episode makes jokes about domestic violence throughout, including musical numbers and cutaway gags that treat serious abuse as material for humor. You can't have it both ways. I'm treating domestic violence as a serious issue, deserving dramatic treatment, while also making jokes about it in the same episode. Domestic violence advocates criticize the episode for its shallow understanding of abuse dynamics and its harmful portrayal of both abusers and survivors. The episode reduces complex trauma and systematic abuse to a problem that can be solved through violence, which misrepresents how domestic violence actually works and what survivors actually need. Jerome is the New Black, Season 8, Episode 7, deals with racism when Peter befriends a black man named Jerome, and Quagmire reveals his racist attitudes. The episode attempts to address racism, but does so by making Jerome almost supernaturally cool and perfect, essentially presenting a magical Negro character who exists to teach white characters about racism. The episode also features Quagmire delivering a long speech about why he hates Brian, which has nothing to do with the racism plot. Quagmire's criticisms of Brian are often valid, pointing out Brian's hypocrisy and self-absorption. But the fact that Quagmire, a literal rapist and sexual predator, is lecturing anyone about morality creates absurd dissonance. What makes this episode disturbing isn't just the clumsy handling of racism, but how it reveals Family Guy's superficial approach to social issues. The show wants credit for addressing racism, while also making Jerome a stereotype of black excellence rather than a fully developed character. It wants to condemn Quagmire's racism while ignoring his far more serious crimes. It wants to address serious topics while maintaining its irreverent comedy style. And the result satisfies nobody. And these controversial episodes reveal a pattern in Family Guy's approach to sensitive topics. The show routinely tackles subjects like abortion, transgender identity, racism, domestic violence, and religious discrimination, but does so in ways that either minimize the seriousness of these issues or actively promote harmful stereotypes and attitudes while claiming to satirize them. The defense is always that Family Guy is satire, that the show is mocking ignorance rather than promoting it, that offensive content is meant to make people think rather than actually endorse bad ideas. But satire requires a clear target and a coherent critique. When you make jokes indistinguishable from genuine bigotry while claiming you're actually making fun of bigots, the distinction becomes meaningless. The real question these controversial episodes raise is whether Family Guy has any responsibility beyond entertaining its audience. Does a show watched by millions, including impressionable teenagers and young adults, have an obligation to avoid promoting harmful ideas about marginalized groups? Or is anything acceptable in pursuit of laughs, regardless of the potential real-world consequences? The show's creators would argue that comedy should have no boundaries, that everything is fair game, and that audiences are smart enough to distinguish between comedy and actual endorsement of bad ideas. Critics counter that Family Guy consistently punches down at vulnerable groups, that its satire is too subtle to be effective, and that its influence is too great to be treated as consequence-free entertainment. What's clear is that these controversial episodes have damaged Family Guy's cultural standing and alienated portions of its audience. While shock humor might generate initial attention and buzz, repeatedly crossing lines eventually leads to diminishing returns as viewers become desensitized or disgusted. The show that once pushed boundaries through clever irreverence now often seems to shock for its own sake, generating controversy without having anything meaningful to say about the subjects it tackles. The multiverse theory, fractured realities and alternate families. One of the most compelling fan interpretations of Family Guy suggests that the show doesn't exist in a single continuous timeline, but rather jumps between multiple universes with subtle or dramatic differences. This multiverse theory, unpopular among fans trying to explain the show's inconsistencies, proposes that character changes and reality-bending moments represent movements between different versions of Quahog. The foundation for this interpretation comes from the canonical Season 8, Episode 1, Road to the Multiverse, where Stewie invents a remote control that can transport users between parallel universes. Brian and Stewie visit numerous alternate realities, including a universe where Christianity never existed and the Dark Ages never happened, a universe where dogs rule and humans are pets, a universe ruled by giant chickens, a Disney-style universe, and even what appears to be our actual reality where Family Guy is just a TV show. This episode definitively establishes that the multiverse is real within Family Guy's fiction. However, some fans have extrapolated beyond this single episode to propose something more radical. What if Family Guy has been jumping between universes throughout its entire run, and we've been watching different versions of the Griffin family without realizing it? Supporters of this theory point to how dramatically different the show feels after its 2005 revival compared to the original 1999 to 2002 run. The characters became meaner, more flanderized, and more willing to cause harm without consequences. The tone shifted from satirical family sitcom to increasingly dark and cruel comedy. The animation style changed, the storytelling structure evolved, and the show's overall identity transformed. The multiverse theory proposes these aren't gradual changes in a single continuous timeline. According to this interpretation, and their evidence that post-cancellation Family Guy takes place in a different universe than pre-cancellation Family Guy. Under this reading, when the show was revived in 2005, we didn't return to the same Quahog we left in 2002. We jumped to an alternate universe where everything is similar but distinctly worse. Fans who support this theory describe what they call Universe Alpha, the original pre-cancellation universe, where Peter is a well-meaning buffoon who genuinely loves his family despite his flaws. Lois is a patient, mostly supportive wife who occasionally loses her temper. Meg is a sympathetic teenager dealing with normal insecurities. Brian is an intellectual voice of reason who calls out the family's worst impulses. Stewie is an evil genius baby whose plans are more ambitious than successful, and the show has heart beneath its crude humor. Under this fan interpretation, what they call Universe Beta represents the post-cancellation universe, where Peter has become a psychopathic man-child incapable of empathy or learning from mistakes. According to this theory, these aren't the same characters who experience gradual development. They're alternate versions with different histories and personalities, similar enough to be recognizable, but distinct enough to feel wrong. Proponents of the multiverse theory point to specific episodes that seem to reset continuity or contradict established facts as support for their interpretation. Characters who died in one episode are alive in the next, with no explanation. Relationships that were established are forgotten or contradicted. Major life events happen and then are never referenced again. Instead of continuity errors, these are evidence of universe jumping. Season 2, Episode 3, Darboom, shows the world destroyed by a nuclear holocaust from Y2K. The Griffin family mutates, with Stewie becoming a tentacle monster. The episode ends with it being revealed as a dream, parodying Dallas's infamous dream season. But fans who subscribe to the multiverse theory ask, what if it wasn't actually a dream? What if the nuclear holocaust really happened in one universe, and the show jumped to another universe where it didn't happen? According to this interpretation, this would explain why the characters feel different after this episode. Under this reading, the originals died in a nuclear apocalypse, and we started following alternate versions who survived because their timeline diverged before Y2K. And every episode after Darboom takes place in a universe where the bombs never fell, but that's not the universe where the show started. The Road to the Multiverse episode itself supports this interpretation. When Stewie and Brian visit the real universe where Family Guy is a TV show, they meet the actual Seth MacFarlane and the real production staff. This suggests that the Family Guy universe we usually watch is just one of infinite possible universes, no more real than any other. The show we think of as the main timeline might just be one random universe among countless others. Some fans have theorized that every episode takes place in a slightly different universe, which is why continuity is so inconsistent. One episode shows Peter and Lois's wedding happening one way. Another episode shows it completely differently. They're not contradictory versions of the same event. They're different events that happened in different universes to different versions of Peter and Lois. This interpretation transforms Family Guy from a show with terrible continuity into a show deliberately depicting multiple timelines. Every reset, every contradiction, every character acting out of character becomes evidence of universe shifting, rather than lazy writing. The show isn't poorly planned. It's documenting the multiverse. Under the multiverse interpretation, Brian's death and resurrection make more sense. Fans who support this theory suggest that when Stewie time traveled to save Brian, he didn't resurrect the Brian who died. Instead, this theory proposes he accessed a timeline where Brian never died in the first place. According to this reading, and the Brian who bled out on that operating table is still dead in one universe. We simply jump to another universe where the car accident never happened. This means, if we accept this theory, every time Stewie uses his time machine, he's not changing the past of his own timeline. He's jumping to an alternate universe where events happen differently. All the original timelines still exist with all their tragedies and deaths intact. Time travel in Family Guy isn't about changing history. It's about finding a better universe and staying there. If we entertain the multiverse theory, then every horrible thing that happens in Family Guy exists in infinite variations across infinite universes. According to this interpretation, every death, every tragedy, every cruelty occurs countless times in parallel realities, and there's also the question of awareness under this theory. Do the characters know they're jumping between universes? Stewie clearly knows about the multiverse canonically and can navigate it deliberately. Brian has traveled with him enough to understand the concept, but fans ask, do Peter, Lois, Chris, and Meg realize that their reality might shift without warning? The theory suggests they probably don't. They seem blissfully unaware that anything is wrong, which is either a blessing or a curse depending on your perspective. They don't notice the inconsistencies, don't question the resets, don't realize they might be different people than they were in previous episodes. They exist in an eternal present. Each episode a new reality they accept as the only reality. The multiverse theory also explains how American Dad can reference Family Guy as a fictional show. In the American Dad universe, Family Guy is a TV series created by Seth MacFarlane. This doesn't contradict Family Guy's reality, because American Dad exists in a different universe where Family Guy is fiction. Multiple universes with different versions of what's real and what's entertainment can coexist in the multiverse. Stan Smith, from American Dad, specifically mentions Brian as his favorite fictional dog, suggesting he watches Family Guy as a TV show. This means the American Dad universe contains a version of our reality, where Seth MacFarlane created an animated comedy called Family Guy. But it also contains the actual Family Guy multiverse as separate but parallel realities. The layers of meta-reality become dizzying when you try to map out the relationships between different shows and universes. What makes the multiverse theory disturbing, according to its proponents, isn't just the implied infinite suffering across infinite timelines. It's that the show we're watching might not matter at all. If every episode takes place in a different universe, if the characters we follow aren't the same characters episode to episode, if nothing has continuity because there is no single continuity to maintain, then this raises questions about narrative meaning. This interpretation transforms Family Guy from a comedy with inconsistent writing into what fans describe as a deliberately nihilistic meditation on the meaninglessness of existence itself. The multiverse becomes both explanation and excuse for everything inconsistent about Family Guy. Inconsistencies, multiverse. Character changes, multiverse. Lack of consequences, multiverse. The show can do whatever it wants without regard for logic or continuity, because the multiverse means nothing has to make sense. Every reset is just a jump to another universe where things are different. This might be the most disturbing aspect of the theory, according to those who subscribe to it. Fans who interpret the show this way argue that Family Guy has created a fictional framework that explicitly rejects meaning, continuity, and consequences. Under this reading, the multiverse isn't just a plot device. It's a philosophical stance that nothing matters because everything exists in infinite variation. We're watching a show that, through this theoretical lens, has codified its own meaninglessness. The multiverse interpretation transforms Family Guy from a comedy with inconsistent writing into what some view as a deliberately nihilistic meditation on the meaninglessness of existence itself. And that's genuinely disturbing when examined through this theoretical framework. Meta-commentary and the fourth wall destruction. Let's talk about how Family Guy constantly breaks the fourth wall, and what this reveals about the show's relationship with reality itself. Family Guy has always been a self-aware show, making jokes about being a TV series, commenting on its own writing, and acknowledging its audience. But over time, this meta-commentary has become so pervasive and explicit that it raises disturbing questions about what's real within the show's universe. The episode Inside Family Guy takes the form of a behind-the-scenes documentary about the making of the show, featuring interviews with Peter, Lois, and other characters treating themselves as actors playing roles. They discuss their experiences working on the show, complain about script decisions, and acknowledge that they're fictional characters performing for an audience. The line between character and actor, fiction and reality, completely dissolves. This isn't just a fun meta episode. It's the show explicitly telling us that the characters know they're characters, that they're aware of being observed, that their reality is constructed for entertainment purposes. Once you establish that level of meta-awareness, you have to question everything else. If Peter knows he's in a TV show, how does that knowledge affect his behavior? Is his violence consequence-free because he knows he's fictional? Does he abuse Meg because he knows she's just a character who will reset next week? Road to the Multiverse includes a visit to what's labeled as the real universe, where Brian and Stewie meet the actual Seth MacFarlane and the real production staff of Family Guy. They stand on the actual Fox studio lot, interact with real humans in live action, and acknowledge that in our universe, they're cartoon characters created for entertainment. This episode confirms that Family Guy exists as a TV show in our reality, but also that Brian and Stewie can access our reality from theirs. The implications are staggering. If characters from Family Guy can visit our universe and interact with their creators, and then the relationship between their fiction and our reality is far more permeable than normal meta-humor suggests. They're not just jokes about being on TV. They're acknowledgements that multiple layers of reality exist simultaneously, and characters can move between them. Throughout the series, characters frequently reference specific episode numbers, production details, and even ratings and network decisions. They complain about being cancelled, celebrate being renewed, and make jokes about their own commercial breaks. In one episode, Peter literally tears away the screen to reveal the animation production behind it, showing sketches and storyboards that supposedly depict the very scene we're watching being created. American Dad has referenced Family Guy multiple times as a fictional TV show within its universe. Any Stan Smith mentions watching it, characters reference it as entertainment, and the show exists as something Seth MacFarlane created in the American Dad timeline. But both shows are created by the same Seth MacFarlane in our reality, creating a strange loop where both shows are fictional to us. Family Guy is fictional within American Dad, but the Seth MacFarlane who created both exists in our reality and can be visited by Family Guy characters. This creates a hierarchy of realities. Our universe sits at the top as real. Below that is the American Dad universe, where Family Guy exists as a TV show. Below that is the Family Guy universe, where characters live their lives unaware they're being watched. But the road to the multiverse episode suggests Family Guy characters can access all levels of this hierarchy, are meeting their creators and seeing their own fictional nature exposed. The disturbing aspect is what this means for the characters. If Peter Griffin knows he's a character in a TV show, knows that nothing he does has real consequences because everything resets, knows that he's being written by people who don't care about his growth or development, how does that knowledge affect his psyche? Does he become more reckless because nothing matters? Does he embrace chaos because he knows there's no permanent price to pay? Some meta jokes suggest the characters are frustrated with their writers and the show's direction. They complain about being in bad episodes, reference when the show sold out or jumped the shark, and express awareness that the quality has declined. These aren't just jokes to the audience, aren't their characters expressing genuine frustration with their own fictional existence? There's something tragic about a character who knows they're trapped in a declining TV show, knows they'll never grow or change because the format requires them to reset every week, knows that they exist solely to entertain an audience that's getting increasingly tired of them. They're aware of their own irrelevance and powerlessness, conscious that they're puppets dancing for viewers who might not even care anymore. The fourth wall breaks also create a disturbing voyeuristic dynamic. When characters address the camera directly, acknowledging our presence as viewers, they're breaking the comfortable fiction that we're invisible observers. They know we're watching them. They know we're complicit in their suffering by continuing to consume their show, and they're making us aware of our role as audience, and therefore our responsibility for their continued existence in this loop. Some episodes feature the characters discussing which episodes were good or bad, creating a self-critical meta-commentary where the show judges its own quality through its characters' mouths. They'll reference specific episode titles, production codes, and air dates, making it clear that within their universe, they're aware of being in a serialized TV show with a measurable history. This level of meta-awareness raises questions about autonomy and free will within the Family Guy universe. If the characters know they're written, know they have writers making decisions for them, know that their actions are predetermined by people in another reality, do they have any genuine agency? Are they choosing to do horrible things, or are they being forced to by their writers? And their awareness of this compulsion makes them essentially prisoners of a narrative they can't escape. The fact that Seth MacFarlane voices Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire creates another layer of meta-reality. The same voice is coming out of multiple characters, sometimes having conversations with himself, and occasionally this fact is acknowledged in the show itself. Characters reference sounding similar or comment on certain voices. The illusion of separate identities breaks down when you remember they're all the same person. When Family Guy characters visit the real world and meet Seth MacFarlane, they're meeting their own voice, their own creator, and someone who exists at a higher level of reality than they do. MacFarlane is a god in their universe, capable of changing their reality at will. But he's also just a person in our reality, subject to the same limitations and mortality as any human. The power dynamic is both absolute and contextual depending on which level of reality we're considering. The show has also acknowledged its own cancellation and revival, with characters referencing those dark years when we weren't on the air, or joking about being saved by DVD sales and Adult Swim reruns. This means the characters experience their show being cancelled as a real event in their timeline, possibly as a form of stasis or non-existence, then being brought back to life when the network renewed the series. What does cancellation feel like from inside the fiction? Do the characters cease to exist during those years, experiencing a kind of death? Or do they continue existing in a limbo state, aware that their show isn't being produced, but unable to do anything about it? The revival wouldn't feel like coming back to life. It would feel like being brought back to work, forced to perform again for an audience that might have moved on. The most disturbing meta element might be the show's awareness of its own declining quality. Characters make jokes about Family Guy not being as good as it used to be, reference jumping the shark, and acknowledge that certain episodes or seasons were worse than others. This isn't subtle commentary. It's the show explicitly telling us through its characters that everyone involved knows the quality has dropped, but they're going to keep going anyway, because the money is good and the audience keeps watching. And this creates a cynical relationship between show and viewer. Family Guy is telling us it knows it's not as good anymore, knows we know it's not as good anymore, but is going to continue churning out episodes anyway, because we haven't stopped watching yet. It's like the show is daring us to finally quit, seeing how far it can push before we give up, acknowledging its own mediocrity while refusing to improve, because there's no financial incentive to do so. The fourth wall breaks transform Family Guy from a comedy about a family into a commentary on television, fandom, creative decline, and the recursive nature of self-aware entertainment. But they also make the show deeply unsettling when you think about what they mean for the characters trapped inside it. Imagine being aware that you're a fictional character, and that your suffering exists for entertainment, that you're stuck in an infinite loop of resetting narratives, that you have no real future or potential for growth, that you're just a collection of jokes and catchphrases animated for profit. Imagine knowing all this but being unable to escape or change your situation, because you're not real enough to have agency, but you're real enough to be conscious of your imprisonment. That's the existential nightmare at the heart of Family Guy's meta-commentary. The characters are trapped in a hell of self-awareness, conscious of their own fictionality, but unable to do anything about it. They'll make the same jokes, experience the same resets, and suffer the same indignities forever because that's what the format requires, and they know it. The fourth wall breaks aren't clever comedy techniques. They're prison bars made visible, showing the characters and the audience the boundaries of the fictional cage, while making it clear that escape is impossible. We're all trapped in this together, characters and viewers, aware of the artificiality but unable or unwilling to break free completely. Death, violence, and the absence of consequences. Let's examine how Family Guy handles death and violence, and what the complete absence of meaningful consequences reveals about the show's deeply disturbing worldview. In most shows, death matters. When a character dies, there are emotional repercussions, plot consequences, and lasting changes to the remaining characters. In Family Guy, death is a revolving door, violence is constant, and nothing ever really matters. Death herself appears as a recurring character in Family Guy, and portrayed as an overweight man who is friends with Peter. He's incompetent at his job, frequently shows up to claim the wrong person, gets distracted from his duties, and generally treats mortality as a casual inconvenience rather than a fundamental aspect of existence. The personification of death as a bumbling idiot suggests that death itself has no real power or meaning in Family Guy's universe. Characters have died and come back with various explanations or no explanation at all. Brian died and was resurrected through time travel. James Woods died but returned in later episodes. Mayor Adam West died when his real-life voice actor passed away, but the character had died and returned multiple times before that. Death is so inconsistent and reversible that it ceases to function as a meaningful threat, and the violence in Family Guy is both constant and consequence-free. Peter can get shot, stabbed, burned, crushed, exploded, or mutilated in one scene, then appear perfectly fine in the next scene with no explanation. His body recovers from injuries that should be fatal or permanently disabling. He's lost limbs that grew back, sustained massive head trauma with no lasting brain damage beyond his pre-existing condition, and survived falls and crashes that should have killed him instantly. This invincibility extends to all the main characters. Brian has been hit by cars, shot, set on fire, and tortured without any lasting damage. Stewie has been in explosions, plane crashes, and violent confrontations without suffering permanent harm. The family survives disasters that should wipe out the entire neighborhood. As then, everything resets for the next episode as if nothing happened. The show has explicitly acknowledged this lack of consequences. Characters have referenced that nothing they do matters because everything will be back to normal next week. They've made jokes about their own immortality, commented on surviving impossible situations, and acknowledged that the show's format prevents genuine change or growth. This meta-awareness of consequence-free existence makes the violence feel even more nihilistic. What makes this disturbing isn't just the violence itself, but what it says about the show's philosophy. In Family Guy's universe, actions don't have consequences, pain is temporary, death is reversible, and nothing you do matters because reality resets constantly. This is existential nihilism portrayed as comedy, a worldview where nothing has meaning because nothing lasts. The chicken fights exemplified this consequence-free violence. Peter and Ernie destroy millions of dollars in property, create situations that should kill bystanders, and cause citywide chaos without ever facing arrest, lawsuits, or even social consequences. The people of Quahog seem to accept that Peter will periodically have extended violent confrontations with a giant chicken, and they just rebuild the damage and move on. This normalization of violence without consequences sends disturbing messages about accountability and responsibility. The show suggests that if you're the main character, you can do whatever you want without facing meaningful repercussions. Peter can drive drunk, assault people, destroy property, and endanger lives, and he'll never truly pay a price for any of it. The contrast between how the show treats death of side characters versus main characters is telling. When Mr. Weed died in early seasons, he stayed dead because he wasn't important enough to the show's formula. When James Woods died, he came back because the show wanted to use him for more jokes. When Brian died, he was resurrected because fans demanded it. Death's permanence is directly proportional to how much the writers want to use that character in future episodes. This creates a horrifying class system within the show's reality. Main characters are essentially immortal, able to survive anything because they're necessary for the show to continue. Supporting characters can be killed and revived based on narrative convenience. Background characters can be slaughtered wholesale without anyone caring because they're just props. Your value as a person in Quahog is determined by how much screen time you get. The show has killed countless unnamed background characters in various disasters, explosions, and violent incidents. These deaths are treated as comedy, as mere numbers to escalate the absurdity of situations. We're meant to laugh at mass casualties because these aren't real people with families and futures. They're just animated bodies created to be destroyed for our entertainment. This callousness toward death extends to how characters react to other people dying. When side characters die, the main cast rarely shows genuine grief or even acknowledgement. They might make a joke about it, express brief sadness, and then move on completely, because maintaining comedy requires emotional detachment from tragedy. Empathy is in short supply in Quahog. The way Family Guy treats suicide is particularly disturbing. Multiple characters have attempted or threatened suicide in ways that are played for laughs rather than treated as serious cries for help. Meg's suicidal ideation is presented as a running gag. Characters casually reference wanting to die in situations where actual suicidal individuals might be watching and feeling validated in their darkest thoughts. The show has also depicted graphic violence in ways that seem designed purely for shock value. Characters have been dismembered, mutilated, tortured, and subjected to graphic bodily harm far beyond what's necessary for any comedic effect. This violence exists for its own sake, and pushing boundaries to see how much the audience will tolerate before it stops being funny and starts being genuinely disturbing. There's something deeply unsettling about a show that presents extreme violence as entertainment, while simultaneously acknowledging that violence should have consequences, then choosing not to apply those consequences because it's more convenient for the format. Family Guy knows that Peter should face repercussions for his actions. The show has literally stated this through its meta-commentary, but it refuses to implement consequences because doing so would disrupt the episodic reset structure. This creates a moral vacuum at the heart of the show. There's no justice, no karma, no meaningful cause and effect relationship between actions and outcomes. Peter can hurt people without guilt. Characters can die without meaning, and the world can be destroyed and rebuilt without anyone learning anything or changing in any way. It's a universe governed by narrative convenience rather than any ethical or logical principles. The absence of consequences also prevents character development. Peter can't learn from his mistakes if his mistakes never have lasting repercussions. Lois can't grow as a person if her actions don't affect her future. Brian can't become better if being worse doesn't cost him anything. The characters are trapped in an eternal present where nothing they do accumulates into meaningful change. This stagnation is presented as a feature of the show's format rather than a flaw. Family Guy embraces the reset button, celebrates the lack of continuity, and treats character growth as something to be mocked rather than achieved. The show has explicitly made fun of serialized storytelling and character arcs, preferring episodic comedy where nothing matters and nothing changes. What makes this genuinely disturbing is the implied worldview. Family Guy suggests that life is meaningless, that our actions don't matter, that growth is impossible, that death is a joke, and that the best we can hope for is to find humor in the absurdity of existence before everything resets, and we do it all again. It's nihilism wrapped in comedy, presenting a fundamentally hopeless vision of reality while asking us to laugh at it. The show has become increasingly explicit about this nihilism over time. Early seasons had more heart, more moments of genuine emotion and connection between characters. Later seasons have stripped away most pretense that anything matters, doubling down on shock value and consequence-free chaos. The evolution of Family Guy is toward greater and greater meaninglessness, toward a reality where nothing is sacred and nothing endures. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all. Family Guy has spent over 2 decades normalizing the idea that violence is fine as long as it's funny, that death doesn't matter if you can come back, that consequences are optional, and that meaning is for other shows. It's trained millions of viewers to accept a worldview where nothing matters and nothing changes, where suffering is comedy and death is a punchline, where the universe is fundamentally empty of purpose or progress. We're watching characters trapped in a nightmare of eternal recurrence, are doomed to repeat the same patterns forever without growth, change, or escape. And we're supposed to find this entertaining. That might be the most disturbing thing Family Guy has ever created. Conclusion: the disturbing legacy of Family Guy. So where does all of this leave us? We've explored fan theories suggesting Peter is insane and his family is dead, that Stewie's fractured perception creates the show's reality, that the entire series jumps between multiple universes, that death and consequences are meaningless, and that the show's meta-awareness traps its characters in acknowledged fictional hell. What do these disturbing interpretations tell us about Family Guy and why it became what it is? At its core, Family Guy represents a show that started with genuine heart and satirical bite, but gradually transformed into something darker and more nihilistic. The early seasons balanced crude humor with real emotion, created characters we could care about despite their flaws, and told stories that actually meant something beneath the jokes. But somewhere along the way, the show evolved into something different. The disturbing theories fans have developed aren't just creative speculation. They're attempts to make sense of a show that has become increasingly senseless, to find meaning in the entertainment that seems to have embraced meaninglessness, to explain why something we once loved has become something that often makes us uncomfortable. These fan interpretations impose structure and logic on a show that appears to have rejected both. And what makes Family Guy genuinely disturbing isn't any single theory or episode. It's the cumulative effect of hundreds of episodes that normalize abuse, violence, predation, and cruelty, while maintaining that nothing matters and nothing changes. It's a show that has spent over 2 decades teaching viewers that consequences are optional, that growth is impossible, that suffering is comedy, and that the universe is fundamentally empty of purpose. The fan theories about Peter's insanity, Stewie's perception, and the multiverse give us frameworks for understanding why Family Guy feels so wrong to many viewers. They suggest that what we're watching isn't meant to be taken as real or coherent, that the inconsistencies and cruelties are symptoms of a fractured reality rather than lazy writing. But even if we entertain these theories as possible explanations, we're still left with a show that traffics in content many find genuinely uncomfortable disguised as humor. Meg's abuse, Quagmire's predation, Brian's death and resurrection, the controversial episodes that crossed every line, the chicken fights that destroy cities, the meta-commentary that acknowledges the show's own evolution. All of this paints a picture of entertainment that has significantly changed over its run. The disturbing fan theories about Family Guy will continue to evolve as the show continues to air. Fans will develop new explanations for new inconsistencies, new frameworks for understanding new developments. These theories serve an important function, and helping viewers process their complicated feelings about a show they may have loved once but view differently now. What we're left with is a show that has documented its own evolution, acknowledged its own shifts in tone and content, and continued regardless of criticism. The legacy of Family Guy will be complicated. It will be remembered for pushing boundaries and influencing comedy, for creating iconic characters and quotable moments, for surviving cancellation and maintaining cultural relevance for decades. But it will also be remembered for its controversial content and the debates it sparked. The disturbing theories about Peter's insanity, Stewie's perception, and the multiverse aren't just fan speculation. They're collective attempts by viewers to find deeper meaning and to understand why something they once enjoyed has evolved in ways that make some uncomfortable. These interpretations give some viewers a framework for continued engagement by suggesting there's more depth than appears on the surface. But maybe the most important truth about Family Guy is simpler than the elaborate theories suggest. It's a show that has evolved significantly over its long run, and viewers have developed these complex interpretations to make sense of that evolution. Whether you view the show through the lens of these fan theories, or simply as an animated sitcom that changed over time, Family Guy remains a fascinating case study in how long-running shows develop, how audiences engage with media, and how entertainment reflects and shapes culture. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the disturbing theories and dark corners of Family Guy. If you enjoyed this exploration of how a beloved comedy evolved and how fans have interpreted that evolution, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the Cartoon Codex for more comprehensive analyses of your favorite animated shows. Until next time, remember that the stories we tell about our entertainment often reveal as much about us as they do about the shows themselves.